99. It's kind of you all to be here. Hi, I'm Cory Doctorow. I work for Electronic Frontier Foundation. I want to tell you a story tonight, a kind of a funny story, a story I sometimes call a funny thing happened on the way to the 21st century. So way back in the Clinton era, Kevin was talking about the... Oh, right, I'll talk a little closer. John was talking about the Communications Decency Act before. The Clinton era was really the golden age of shitty ideas about the internet. And among them was not just the Communications Decency Act, but in 1998 we got the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You'll know the DMCA because it's the author of all your favorite YouTube videos. This video has been removed thanks to a claim by the DMCA. So the DMCA is this big, gnarly hairball of copyright and internet law. And it has this one clause, Section 1201. Section 1201 says that if you bypass a technical protection measure protecting a copyrighted work, you commit a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. So that sounds very kind of abstract and weird and intimidating. Basically, it means if there's anything that restricts access to a copyrighted work and you tamper with it for any purpose, you commit a felony and you can potentially go to jail. So when this was enacted, the idea was that we would let Sega have a monopoly over who could make games for Dreamcast consoles, right? If you wanted to make a Dreamcast game, you would have to go to Sega. Sega would burn it onto a CD. They'd charge you some money. They'd pass it on to your customers. But over the years, this thing has metastasized. So in the early 2000s, there were a couple of companies that decided, well, maybe we can make this DMCA law work for us. So there's a company called Lexmark that makes printers. They were IBM's printer division back in around 2002, 2003. And they made these toner cartridges. And the toner cartridges were filled with dust. They charged more for the dust than you'd pay for caviar. And if your cartridge ran dry and you put new dust in it, it wouldn't work in your printer anymore because that had a chip in it. And the chip had a little program in it whose only job was to say, I am an empty cartridge when all the dust ran out. So one of their competitors, a company called Static Controls, made a new chip that reverse engineered the old chip that would say, I'm a full cartridge. And Lexmark brought Static Controls to court, and they said, the law says that breaking anything that protects a copyrighted work is a felony. Our little 12-byte program, that's a copyrighted work. Therefore, by reconfiguring this toner cartridge, you've committed an act of piracy. And the court said, you know, software is technically copyrightable, but 12 bytes of software is not technically copyrightable. That's just too small, right? So that was 2002, back when computers were expensive. Now we live in 2016 and computers are really, really cheap. And the toner cartridges and like an HP inkjet, they've got 50,000 lines of code in them. There is no question as to whether or not that code is copyrightable. And here's the thing. At core, what the DMCA says is if you have a commercial preference about how you would like your customers to use your product, like say you would prefer that your customers only get service from you, or only get parts from you, or only get consumables from you, under normal circumstances, that preference would be just that, a preference. You couldn't force your customers to do it. You couldn't prohibit your competitors from making it possible for your customers to thwart your commercial desires. But under DMCA 1201, if you design your product so that using it in any way except for the way that you want your customers to use it requires breaking some kind of technical lock on a copyrighted work, then thwarting your commercial desires becomes a felony. And there has never been a CEO who didn't lull themselves to sleep by dreaming about the day in which Uncle Sugar would make it a felony to thwart their commercial desires. So in 2015, the U.S. Copyright Office held hearings on this rule. And they asked, are there problems that are arising from this rule? And what they heard surprised even us at EFF. So these technical locks that restrict access to copyrighted works in order to force you to use products in certain ways have proliferated into virtually every class of goods that you can imagine. We found these technical locks are sometimes called DRM. We found them in voting machines and insulin pumps and tractors and cars. So GM puts a DRM on its engine so that if you want to diagnose what's wrong with a GM car, you either commit a felony by making your own tool to diagnose it, or you buy a tool from GM that costs $75,000 to diagnose your car. And in that way, they can enforce this commercial preference that only GM mechanics fix GM cars. So, yeah, it's a vertical monopoly, right? So this is bad enough on its face because it's a grotesque ripoff for all of us, and it affects all of us in lots of terrible ways. But it's particularly terrible because the way that this statute has been interpreted since it was enacted also covers any kind of security disclosures about defects in products. So say you're investigating a printer or a car or a thermostat or any of the other devices that have these technical protection measures in them, and you discover that there's some defect in them that the user should know about, that puts the users of these products at enormous risk. Like if it's an insulin pump, there are defects that have been discovered in insulin pumps that can allow an attacker to wirelessly cause the insulin pump to dump all of its insulin at once and kill the person who has the insulin pump implanted in them. Right, in the case of cars, Chrysler fielded and then had to recall 1.4 million Jeeps that it turned out could be driven over the internet by attackers by bypassing their fiendishly clever security measure, which was we use Sprint for our internet access, no one else has Sprint, therefore our Jeeps are secure. So if you disclose one of these security vulnerabilities, the way the statute has been interpreted, you are considered to be bypassing the copyright protection because you are telling someone how to outmaneuver the software author. So the thing is that when security vulnerabilities aren't disclosed, it doesn't mean they aren't exploited. It just means that the people against whom they're exploited don't know that it's going on. So this week we saw this giant dump of exploits that the CIA had developed, the Vault 7 exploits, where they had investigated vulnerabilities in widely used software. Are you carrying food for Cory? Oh, okay. So they investigated and discovered all these vulnerabilities in widely used consumer software, and then rather than disclosing them to the manufacturers, they had weaponized them. They figured out how to make them exploitable. So after the WikiLeaks disclosure, a Harvard team went to see how many of the CIA leaks had been independently recreated by criminals who were hacking computers to commit identity fraud and other kinds of fraud, theft of trade secrets and so on. And an enormous number of these vulnerabilities had been independently discovered. So what this law has done is not just given firms the legal right to turn their commercial preferences into legally enforceable rights, it's also given them the right to be custodians of reports of defects in their own products. Now, call me a crazy person, but I think telling the truth should always be legal, even if it's inconvenient to companies, right? If you know a true fact about a defect in someone's product, revealing it in ways that don't give them time to remediate it might be a dick move, but it shouldn't be illegal, right? The government should not be in the business of regulating who can tell the truth. But if the government were to get in the business of regulating who can tell the truth, of all the people you could put in charge of who gets to disclose bad news about defects in products, the last person you'd want to put in charge of that is the company that manufactured that product. And so we have given firms every incentive they need to use these copyright locks in order to control the way that their customers use them, to monopolize the supply chain, to monopolize the ecosystem, but also to become custodians of true facts about defects in their own products. So I went back to EFF after a 10-year hiatus when I went off and made up fairy tales to help you entertain yourself in the long slog from the cradle to the grave. But I went back to EFF because this stuff had started to really alarm me, and also because I thought with EFF we could do something about it. Yeah. So I went back to work on this project we're calling Apollo 1201. Like the Apollo mission, it's a 10-year project to repeal Section 1201 of the DMCA and its analogs all over the world. And in 10 years, we plan on getting rid of all the DRM in the world forever. So last summer, we filed suit against the U.S. government on behalf of two great stalwarts, Matthew Green, a security researcher at Johns Hopkins, Andrew Bunny Huang, a legendary hardware hacker who's also at the MIT Media Lab. And we are asking the courts to invalidate Section 1201 of the DMCA. And while we're waiting for that to work its way through the courts, we're not resting on our laurels. So one of the places we've been working very hard is at the World Wide Web Consortium. This is the normally the bastion of the open web. They make the standards that allow anyone to make a browser or a server. But when Netflix went to them and said, we will boycott the web unless you give us DRM standards for the web, they caved. And so we went back to them and said, all right, if you're going to make DRM for video on the web, at least make your members promise not to use the DMCA to attack security researchers who discover vulnerabilities in web browsers that are used by billions of people worldwide. And instead of helping us out on this, they decided that they would instead make guidelines to dictate to security researchers when they can tell the truth and when they can't. Guidelines that don't bind their members, but bind security researchers. So this is a fight that we're engaged with right now. We have amazing allies in this fight, the Royal National Institute for Blind People in the UK, Vision Australia, SSB BART and Benetech here in the US, BrailleNet in France, the German National Library, Eindhoven, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, Stanford, Oxford, this amazing coalition that's come together to fight on this. And I think we have a serious chance of winning, even though the largest corporations in the world are stacked up against us. And this is typical of the kind of work EFF does. We grab legal fights and we tie them up with technical fights, with normative fights, with market fights, and we use all of those forces to try to affect change in the world. So the fight over the destiny of the internet is not the most important fight we have, right? There are way more pressing issues than how the internet is regulated. Issues like how we're going to address climate change, what we're going to do about fundamental equities, about racial justice, about justice in gender and gender identity, about economic inequality, and many more pressing issues than the future of the internet. But every one of those fights is going to be won or lost on the internet. And without a free, fair, and open internet to win those fights on, we've lost before we've even started. So that's where EFF lives. We live at the bottom of the stack. We are securing the field on which the battles will be fought and won. So you may be confronting some of these fights. You may be thinking about things like gender equality or climate change and asking how you yourself can change them. And it's easy to despair, right? You yourself, you cannot recycle your way out of climate change. No matter how much recycling you do, you personally can't affect climate change by what you do. The only way we're going to affect big structural changes and big structural problems is with collective action. And that's where EFF and groups like EFF-Austin come in, is by binding together the labor, the passion, and the beliefs of millions of people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, to allow them to work together towards a common goal. And, you know, when I look every month at the choices that I make, you know, I try to recycle, I try to buy ethically sourced web hosting services and ethically sourced, you know, dinner and ethically sourced cars and ethically sourced rides and ethically sourced airplanes and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, no matter how many personal choices you're making, a really significant fraction of the money you spend every month is going to corporations that are trying to destroy the world you want to live in. And it's easy to despair. You know, no matter how pure you are, there will always be someone purer than you, and they will still be wanting, right? Like every vegetarian eventually meets a vegan, and every vegan eventually meets a breatharian, right? So rather than trying to spend my way into heaven by making purchase choices that only go to companies that are doing good, I took a lesson from a woman named Denise Cooper that some of you might know. She's one of the great kind of theorists of open source and one of the great flag bearers for open source. And Denise says that what she does is every month she adds up how much money she spent on corporations that are trying to destroy the world she wants to live in, and she gives it to organizations that are trying to rescue it from those corporations, right? And it's not just EFF. This is the amazing thing, is I took 10 years out of EFF, and when I left, it was pretty much just EFF, EFF-Austin, the Free Software Foundation. And when I came back, I found that every organization had found that it had an electronic brief, right? There is no question of just electronic freedom anymore, right? If you're working on environmental issues, you have to care about the internet. And if you're working on gender equality, you have to care about the internet. And so every organization, no matter where you live in that stack, no matter what issue is your pet issue, no matter where you're putting your passion, they have a division that is working on saving the electronic future. A division that thinks of the internet not just as a better recruiting system for jihadi fighters or a better pornography distribution system or the world's greatest video on demand system, but that recognizes that the internet is the nervous system of the 21st century. It's the thing that wires together all of the devices that we use. Everything we do today involves the internet, and everything we do tomorrow will require it. And so securing the internet, making it free, fair, and open forever is the most foundational mission that we have, and there are so many organizations that work on it. So I'm going to finish by talking about the future, because I'm a science fiction writer, and as a science fiction writer, people ask me all the time whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the future. And really what they're asking me to do is to make a prediction. And if there's one thing I've learned as a science fiction writer, it's that we suck at predicting the future, right? Science fiction writers, you'll forget the expression, we are Texas marksmen. We fire a shotgun into the side of the barn, and we draw the target around the place where the pellets went in, right? We've made a lot of guesses about what the future would be, and we ignore all of our misses and pay a lot of attention to our hits. But you know what? It doesn't matter that the future is unknowable. Because imagine you were an optimist. Imagine that you thought that tomorrow we would overcome all of these terrible things and we would secure the internet as a fair, free, and open place where we could have all of these other policy fights. If you believe that and you truly believed it, you should get up every morning and do everything you could to make sure that came to pass. Because the consequences of it not coming to pass are too grave to consider. And say you were a pessimist. Say that you thought that this shitty internet entertainment law from the Clinton era would become the kind of horseman that brought us totalitarian control, that we would be Huxley'd into the full Orwell. You should get up every morning and do everything you could to stop that from happening. So it doesn't matter if you're an optimist or a pessimist, your course of action is the same. Instead of that, I ask you to have hope. Hope is why when your ship sinks in the sea, you tread water. Not because you have a realistic chance of being rescued, but because everyone who was rescued treaded water until rescue arrived. Because hope is the necessary but insufficient precondition for victory. So we are very near victory. People care about this stuff in a way that they didn't 15 years ago. We may not have reached peak surveillance, but we have reached peak indifference to surveillance. The number of people whose lives have been affected by shitty internet law will only go up from here, and the number of natural allies we have in this fight will only go up from here. And so I'm going to ask you to join EFF-Austin, to join EFF, but perhaps more importantly, I'm going to ask you to think about these issues, and then in a week or two, find two people, not people who are like civilians, people who are on the sidelines here, but people who are like deep nerds like all of you, right? People who should care about this stuff but don't, and have this conversation with them. And then go back to them a couple of weeks later and ask them if they'll find two people and have this conversation with them too. Because we have a natural constituency out there, a lot of low-hanging fruit we've never picked. And you guys can help us pick it. So thank you very much. Thank you, EFF-Austin. Thank you, South by Southwest. Pleasure to see you all. Thank you.